Every time the economy stumbles, the headlines begin. Will the Fed raise rates? Is a recession coming? Inflation soars. We watch one person, the chair of the Federal Reserve, walk to a podium and speak a few carefully chosen words that can send markets soaring or tumbling. They seem trapped in an impossible bind. Do too little, and inflation eats away at our savings. Do too much, and they might trigger a recession, costing millions their jobs. This is why, for the past 40 years, the Fed's playbook has been one of overwhelming force. At the first sign of a financial crisis, in 1987, 2001, 2008, 2020, they flood the system with money. They act preemptively, massively, and decisively. Their greatest fear isn't doing too much, it's the terror of doing too little. But why? Why is the default response always a monetary fire hose, even at the risk of creating the next bubble? To understand this, you have to go back to a time when they did the exact opposite. You have to understand the single greatest failure in the Federal Reserve's history. This modern playbook of intervention exists for one reason. It's a direct, multi-generational reaction to the moment the Fed had the power to stop the Great Depression and chose not to. The story of the Great Depression is not a story about the stock market crash of 1929. That was just the trigger. The real catastrophe was the wave of bank failures that followed. The Fed, America's newly created lender of last resort, was designed for this exact moment. But its leaders, bound by a rigid economic doctrine and paralyzed by a power vacuum, stood aside and watched the American banking system collapse. This is the story of that failure, a ghost that haunts every decision made in the halls of power today, forcing them to always choose the devil they know over the devil they once unleashed. To understand the Federal Reserve's paralysis, you first have to understand the man who held it all together, Benjamin Strong, Jr. The Fed wasn't created as a single powerful entity. Its architects, deeply suspicious of centralized financial power, had deliberately fractured it into 12 regional banks. It was a system designed to be a committee of rivals, not a decisive command center. But for its 14 years, it had a king. Benjamin Strong, the formidable governor of the New York Fed, was the system's undisputed center of gravity. Through sheer force of will, intellect, and personal relationships with European central bankers, he bent the decentralized system to his vision. When he wanted to raise or lower interest rates, the other governors followed. He was, for all intents and purposes, the Federal Reserve. And then, in October 1928, just 1 year before the Great Crash, he died of tuberculosis. His death didn't just remove a leader, it created a catastrophic power vacuum. The system he had dominated instantly reverted to its default state, a leaderless squabble. The New York Fed lost its primacy, and power diffused to bickering factions in Washington and Chicago. What they didn't know was that the greatest economic test in American history was bearing down on them. Because Strong was gone, the institution he commanded was left rudderless. The orchestra had lost its conductor, right as the storm was about to break. That test arrived in the fall of 1930. With the memory of the crash still raw, a wave of rural banks in the South and Midwest began to buckle. This was the moment the Federal Reserve was built for. Its most powerful tool was something called the discount window. Think of it as an emergency room for banks. A fundamentally healthy bank, short on cash during a panic, could bring its good loans to the Fed and get an emergency infusion of money to stay afloat. It was designed to stop a single failure from becoming a contagion. But in the power vacuum left by Benjamin Strong, men like the new Fed governor, Eugene Meyer, and the influential board member, Adolph Miller, saw the world differently. They looked at the struggling banks not as victims of a panic, but as poorly managed institutions that had made bad bets. When these banks came to the discount window, Meyer and Miller's Fed turned them away. Their logic was cold and calculated. Providing a loan would simply reward bad behavior. This decision was the first domino. By refusing to be the lender of last resort, the Fed sent a terrifying message to the entire financial system. No one is coming to save you. This singular failure to act is precisely why, today, at the first tremor of a banking crisis, the modern Federal Reserve doesn't just open the window, it kicks down the door and floods the entire system with unimaginable amounts of cash. They are haunted by the ghost of Meyer's choice. To understand why Meyer and Miller stood aside, you have to understand the powerful ideology that gripped them. Their inaction wasn't born of panic or incompetence, it was a deliberate, calculated policy rooted in a rigid economic philosophy known as the real bills doctrine. In their minds, the Fed's job was only to support the real economy, loans for building factories or shipping goods. Money used to buy stocks or speculate on land wasn't real, it was a sin. Lending to a bank that had financed such speculation was, to them, morally wrong. It was like giving a drunk another drink. This wasn't some obscure academic theory. It was an economic gospel preached by the most powerful men in the country. Adolph Miller was its high priest on the Federal Reserve Board. But its most famous apostle was Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, one of the world's richest men. His advice to President Hoover was chillingly direct. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Mellon and Miller believed the crash was a necessary and even healthy event. It was a moral cleansing, a fire that would purge the rottenness out of the system. Letting weak banks and overextended businesses fail was the harsh medicine the economy needed to heal. Because they were so convinced that this pain was virtuous, they systematically blocked the one cure that could have worked: liquidity. This gospel of liquidation proved so utterly catastrophic that it forged the core mandate of every central banker who followed: never, ever let the system purge itself. But even if men like Eugene Meyer wanted to ignore the gospel of liquidation, their hands were tied by another, even more powerful force: the gold standard. This is the structural reason modern central banks have powers that Meyer could only dream of. Think of the gold standard as a national debit card. Every dollar printed had to be backed by a real physical amount of gold sitting in a government vault. You couldn't just create money out of thin air. And here was Meyer's trap. If he printed billions to save the banks, foreign countries holding dollars would get nervous. They would see the U.S. turning on the printing presses and fear that American money was becoming worthless. Their next move would be to cash in their dollars for gold, draining America's vaults dry. The consequence would be a catastrophic collapse in the value of the dollar on the world stage. So Meyer faced a calculated but devastating choice: save America's banks or save the dollar's credibility. For him and the entire international financial order of the time, it wasn't a choice at all. Preserving the gold standard was the prime directive. Because of the golden handcuffs he wore, the domestic economy would have to bleed. This high-level decision, to sacrifice the banks to save the dollar, had a terrifying, immediate consequence on the streets of America. It unleashed the very demon the Federal Reserve was created to chain: the bank run. A bank is a confidence game. It only holds a fraction of its deposits as cash. The rest is loaned out. It works only so long as we all believe it works. But when the Fed publicly let the Bank of United States fail in New York in late 1930, dismissing it as poorly run, they sent a fatal signal to the entire country. The message was, you are on your own. This decision is why the modern playbook is the exact opposite. Today, regulators know that fear is a contagion that logic cannot stop. After the Fed stood aside, a rational depositor had to ask, if they won't save a huge New York bank, why would they save my small-town bank in Ohio? The answer was clear, and so the lines began to form. It didn't matter if a bank was healthy. The rumor of trouble was enough to create it. A neighbor's panic became your panic. This wave of fear washed over the country, destroying thousands of banks, solvent and insolvent alike, and vaporizing the life savings of millions. This vaporization of savings wasn't just a metaphor, it was a mechanical reality. And it's the direct reason why, in any modern crisis, the Federal Reserve's first and only instinct is to flood the world with money. They are haunted by what happened next. So, where did all the money go? It simply vanished. Most people think of money as physical cash printed by the government, but that's only a tiny fraction. The vast majority of money is created by commercial banks every time they make a loan. Think of it this way. When a bank gives you a $100 loan, it doesn't take that cash from someone else's account. It simply types $100 into your account. New money is born. But when a bank fails, the reverse happens. All the loans on its books, all that digitally created money, are wiped out. The money dies. Between 1930 and 1933, as thousands of banks collapsed, this process repeated itself on a terrifying scale. For every dollar a depositor lost, many more dollars in loans were erased from existence. It was a chain reaction of annihilation. This is the Great Contraction. The money supply of the United States didn't just shrink, it was surgically reduced by a third. The economy wasn't just in a recession, it was being systematically starved of the oxygen it needed to function. And the Federal Reserve, the one institution with the power to create money, simply stood by and watched it burn. As the country suffocated, one man in the White House saw the disaster unfolding with perfect, horrifying clarity: President Herbert Hoover. History has painted Hoover as passive, but his private letters and diaries tell a different story. He was a man screaming into a void, begging the Federal Reserve to act. He repeatedly pleaded with its governor, Eugene Meyer, to pump credit into the system, to do something to stop the failures. But Meyer refused. And this is why the relationship between any modern president and the Fed chair is so tense and carefully watched. Because of a principle Meyer was sworn to uphold: central bank independence. The Federal Reserve was designed, by law, to be insulated from political pressure. A president could not order it to print money, just as he can't today. This was a deliberate choice, meant to stop politicians from juicing the economy for short-term electoral gain. The strategic irony was devastating. Hoover, the President of the United States, was powerless. He could only watch as Meyer, clinging to the dogma of the gold standard and the belief that bad banks must be liquidated, refused to open the taps. Meyer wasn't a villain. He was a man of conviction, executing a calculated but catastrophic policy. The system built to protect America from political folly was now enforcing a doctrinal one, and the president's pleas were nothing more than noise. This catastrophic inaction is the ghost in the machine of modern finance. The memory of Meyer's refusal and Hoover's powerlessness became the foundational trauma for the Federal Reserve. It's the terrifying story every central banker is told on their first day. Because of this failure, a new, unwritten mandate was born: never again. This is why, in 2008, when the financial system began to seize up, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke didn't hesitate. Bernanke wasn't just an economist. He was one of the world's foremost scholars of the Great Depression. He knew exactly which ghost he was fighting. When he unleashed trillions of dollars in bailouts and quantitative easing, a fancy term for creating money to buy assets, he wasn't just saving banks. He was performing a direct, calculated exorcism of the dogma that had paralyzed his predecessors.
He was doing everything Meyer and the Fed of the 1930s refused to do. And it's why in 2020, as the pandemic triggered a global shutdown, Chairman Jerome Powell acted with even more overwhelming speed and force. The playbook Bernanke wrote in 2008 was now gospel. The lesson was so deeply ingrained that the only strategic option was to flood the system with unprecedented support, preempting even the possibility of a contraction. The ghost of the real bills doctrine was finally vanquished, replaced by a new doctrine: when in doubt, print. The great irony is that in solving the problem of the 1930s, we have created the dilemmas of the 21st century. We have a system that is now programmed for massive intervention. The ghost of the Great Depression has been replaced by the expectation of a great bailout, leaving us to wonder if the machine built to protect us from our past is now steering us toward a different, unknown crisis.
If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden causes, and leave a comment. What do you think is the biggest financial risk we face today?